Now, Peter, you've joined a bunch of live streams. Have we done a Randos conversation before?
We haven't. We haven't. I
Okay.
think I was in some of the live streams. I have been for over a year in the British meeting server, but yeah, mostly I haven't joined that many occasions. No.
Okay. Do you want to sort of do kind of a traditional Randos thing where you want to go through your bio, or what would you like to do with your time?
I think I'm quite open. We can talk about Vicky Talkie stuff. We can also go into my bio, but I think you're more comfortable with first knowing my background and being then interested in the other stuff and how that
Definitely.
relates.
That tends very much to be once I get to know you, then what you think
Yeah.
about is of much more interest to me because of course it's part of the context and the relationship. So why don't we start there? Why don't we go ahead and just start talking about yourself and your childhood, where you grew up, how that went, and
Okay.
then we'll see where it goes from there.
I think that's a good idea. I would appreciate it if we would not so much talk about work, but the other stuff I think is great. Let's do that.
Okay.
Um, I think where to begin. I come from Germany. I think my accent might make it plausible that this is the case. And so I have been born in the northern part of Germany. My father's side stems from Denmark, in fact. And so my first and last name is due to a family tradition of, I would say, about 400 years. Every firstborn son was called Peter, and only the sons have that kind of tradition. There's no Petra or something like this. But yeah, this is the case. So my father has that name. My grandfather was the second born, and so he wasn't called that way. And
Mm.
this is some kind of, I think, important thing to know because there is really a very big difference between my father's side and my mother's side, and there is some there's a lot of high esteem that one wants to be enough. One wants to be as good as the people before oneself, and I think that's a big impact and a big factor in my life. The other thing is my mother comes from a family that lived on the east side of Germany, or
Oh.
more clearly said, from the former regions of Germany, because nowadays it's a part of Poland. So we lost that. And we also lost in the Second World War the Danish part of the family. And there are now a great many facilities, a lot of very expensive houses standing there, and all was lost. All was lost. And so both parts of the family had that kind of experience. My
Mm.
grandmother of my mother's side used to joke that she was carrying the little Roland, my uncle, on her arms, and they were carrying him over to the other side of the Berlin Wall. And so that was the situation then. And I think my grandmother is strongly involved in the belief of Catholicism. She has those virtues, I would say,
Hmm.
virtues which you only understand as you grow older and learn to appreciate what
Hmm.
they have gained, a certain wisdom, so to speak, that is honed in practice, but not necessarily in propositional knowledge.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think my father's side was always more on the propositional side of things.
Hmm.
And so there was that kind of split, and the realization in my mother that the world is not as innocent as we grew up to believe, because
Mm.
they had the assumption, okay, if you only do what is good, do only what is virtuous and within the confines of a faith, then everything will work out. And I think
Mm.
a lot of the family has been disillusioned by that,
Mm.
disenchanted, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I really often notice that in my mother, that she tries to liberate my grandmother somewhat,
Mm.
to make it better for her, because she is of the opinion that she has to carry it through. We didn't have the money, she says. We didn't have the luxuries. We just had to do what was necessary.
Hmm.
And there was something like an inbuilt idea of an internalized duty,
Yeah.
something similar to what Peterson often says, in the sense of you have that duty, you must do it. And this is something that I think really stems from the Christian tradition, similarly like the categorical imperative in Immanuel Kant. It is only a secularized version of it. And this kind of idea, the internalized duty, no such thing in my father's side. Nothing like that.
Wow. How did that go? How did they meet? How did your father and mother meet?
I think that's also something strange. My mother was working, as a helper in an apothecary. And so she was working there, and she was working for a partner. And I think it was, what is it called when they look and search for a partner via an agency? I don't know the English word for that. Yes, a matchmaker agency. And I think my father was one of the people who stood out, and they were saying to her, "Oh yes, that's one of the kind of typical guys that a woman would like to have. He's big, he is seemingly successful, and maybe in the long run it would have worked because a great many things that he had as good qualities would be good in the long run. But in the short run, a small child is quite boring, and I think it's very different to always be at home and then go to work, and to have 1 or 6 beers too many after work, and then have someone from your own working place live at home, and then draining all the energy, both of the family, out of the father, the mother, and there's a split happening. And so very early on, there was, I think, massive impact on the relationship. So it wasn't built to last, to say the least.
So how was that for, how old were you when your parents split up?
I think 5 or 6 years old.
Oh, so you're very young.
Yes, most definitely. Usually think it's 7, but I wasn't really conscious at the time. I wasn't really in the age where a certain awareness of my surroundings had really built up, or the ability to memorize it wasn't really there. I remember my stepmother, who's great. The stepmother usually sounds like, oh, this bad stepmother, and it's similarly like in the stories of good and evil. No. She's really great. And she was introduced to me in a very interesting fashion. It was, I came every second weekend to my father's house, and she was there. And I was just looking at her. She greeted me, and I walked across her to my room, completely ignoring her. And
well, a little boy doesn't quite know what, I mean, a little boy doesn't understand, doesn't know what to do. Yeah, no, obviously, yeah.
Neither did she.
Neither did she. That's right.
Yes.
Did you split time then between your parents? Did you go back and forth?
Yes, exactly. Every second weekend I was in my father's, and the rest of the time with my mother. And we did have, or really invent, the word Scheidungskrieg, a war of divorce, before it was in the German Duden, in the vocabulary books. So we had, I think, a fight with a law involved for about 10 years.
Wow.
Yes, this is the second highest amount of time that I have ever heard any family have a divorce.
Yeah.
So the worst case was double that almost. But I've never heard anything that was longer than my case. And I left my mother's house with 16 years old when I, moved over to my father. And she also married, but this was not a good marriage. My mother has a bad experience. It seems that she always gets the wrong men. And I was introduced to him very differently than to my stepmother, with the sentence, "This is now your new father." And a young child doesn't like that. And my first reaction was crying.
Yes. So how do you think this domestic situation impacted you growing up? I mean, as a kid, you don't realize anything because this is the only reality you know. So,
Yes.
But of course, you look back on it, you say,
As I would say massively. It most definitely impacted me, but it is with regards that you cannot trust the sudden or immediate appearance of things. When you go from one house and then you hear the sentences, you are completely changed. You are very different from usual. Your mother has done this to you. You are very different from your usual self. And when you go to your mother and hear the same sentences with regards to your father, everything changes and you cannot really accept the way things are as they appear. And you are, in a sense, sanctioned for everything that you do. And the best strategy is then to do nothing. You build a lot of restraint and inhibitions. And I think this is very important that we are talking about this because I asked in the German language chat if I should mention it, what should I say, what shouldn't I say? And I think one topic that is of utmost importance for many people and with regards to the meaning crisis and nihilism and the father figure Peterson is, many people do grow up without a father figure. And I think what is the psychological impact on the people and why does it come so that Peterson becomes relevant and why does it sometimes work and not work? And I think his approach is a pragmatic approach and it works sometimes, but not for those cases who have very strong inhibitions and a very strong restraint, because this leads to the difficulty of how can you re-enchant yourself when there's a gulf between you and the world, when everything is world as appearances and you're always sanctioned for everything that you do wrong, even if you think it's the right thing you do. And so there is something in there which is very Freudian, very psychoanalytic. And I think I'm a classic case, so to speak, of that. I'm a cliche, but a very picturesque cliche, I would say.
No, that's really, I think, a huge and helpful insight. I think, so as you said, there's a lot of discussion now in terms of enchantment.
Yes,
Enchantment, and I was just before this, I'm still making my way through that 3 hour plus Vervaeke, Smachtenberger, McGilchrist video, which is a big video. But there's a ton of good stuff in that video. And, McGilchrist is talking about trust. And I think what you just laid out very much impacts, I mean, kids have to, they're always sort of recalibrating, and they're recalibrating in terms of, trust is so foundational. Can I trust my map? Can I trust my parents? Can I trust that the moment, what's the relationship between this moment now and the enduring situation? And that's so difficult when, I mean, children of divorce, it goes different ways. Sometimes, as, Grim Grizz talks about this, he grew up not knowing his father. So he grew up in a fractured situation, but without the father. Then it's more common in situations of divorce for people to grow up in two spaces. Now everybody, I mean, if you like, I had home and I had school, but home was always one space with both parents. When your parents are split, now you've got two spaces, and as a kid, you have to navigate those two spaces. And of course, there's one of you having to navigate those two spaces. That's going to deeply impact your calibrations, and especially if you have. I mean, I think you put it very well. That you've got difficulty with appearances, and especially as you said quite nicely, a father says to a child, or a mother says to a child, here's your new father. It's like, what does that mean? And of course, a 6-year-old can't look at his mom and say, what does that mean, Mom? Because of course the 6-year-old, it's just whoosh, just right over the head. And now over the next how many years, and then you have the dynamic in many situations where, I've often spoken with couples who are splitting up and there are children, and I usually really advise them to not have additional romantic partners. They never take that advice.
You need to stay together and not divorce, because in the interest of the children, it's important.
Well, yeah, that the primary, the best case scenario is stay together. The second best case scenario is, okay, if you're going to split up, now don't bring new adults into that have to function as, and again, that doesn't mean that you can't have a wonderful stepmother and a wonderful relationship with a stepmother, because that happens too. I mean, the difficulty here is, of course, you can't just make a one set rule to cover everyone and everything. But generally
Mm,
speaking, odds are the additional, if I don't know how it went with you, but the situation is
mm.
okay, here's your new daddy, but new daddy's only there for a few years and he's gone again. And then there's a new daddy and a new daddy. And for the kid, of course, this is dads and moms are really foundational mappings for us in terms of that has to get exapted and expanded out into the world.
I think that is a very terrible thing to have, but in my case, it was worse. He stayed.
Oh, that can't be worse.
But yes, I can imagine that. I have the situation with my cousin. I have multiple cousins, but one of the cousins on my mother's side used to say, "Before I introduce another girl to my sweet, sweet daughter, I will just wait and wait. I must be careful before I introduce them." But I think this question of attachment is really relevant in the multiple situations. There's so much stuff to be said about what you mentioned before, but take it, for example, that the people speak today of the West. They speak of left and right brained. And when you are in this kind of position that I am in, you have this observational picture that you are leaning back and not really participating. You're looking at things and you're consciously looking what kind of motive should I now follow. It's similar like in the internet where you have one tab next to each other and you have people with 3 or 5 tabs, not very smart people. When you have 10 or 20 tabs, and I'm one of those people who has hundreds of tabs, and I have this strange kind of consciousness where language plays a very, very inferior role. I have to immediately translate my abstract representations of the world into German, and I have now the difficulty to speak to you, but I have sometimes to first search for the German version and then to look for the English version before I can speak to you. And
Yes.
this is an act of multiple, immediately anticipating what is now going to happen. And I wrote to you about Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the Enlightenment, and the disenchantment and the problems of disenchantment, because I think this is the easiest way to grasp what was Schopenhauer's critique of the difficulty with religion. The difficulty with religion is when you have a mind like this, with a restraint and always looking laid backwards, there is something good about it. There's something very clear. You know what you have to expect. You are in control, but you are not embedded. You are not embedded. And this disenchanted position has reached a systematic height in Schopenhauer, and that led Nietzsche then to the utmost important conclusion: this is not a solution, this is a system which is the height of disenchanted perspective, but the way to live pragmatically is different. And Schopenhauer also said this. He was very conscious of this. He really knew that you first have to speak before you can formulate the rules for grammar. You first have to dance and make the music before you can write down the techniques, he says. And so similar it is with scientific methods. You first have to speculate, and therefore there was an aristocratic element in it. He said, well, of course, he is a genius. Schopenhauer was a genius, but he could claim it. And he met Goethe. He thought about Immanuel Kant, and he said, do you imagine that some of those people we have nowadays in our universities would be capable of what Kant did? No, they would not. And we have some people who define the direction in which we go, and we have a large amount of executives who are then the second-hand dealers in opinion. And I think what has really happened nowadays, and this is my critique of the reception of the counter-enlightenment today, is wrong. It's based on the wrong premise, because it is the summary of a great amount of people going and working in different directions. And when I come in the situation, I have long time spent on different philosophers for my whole life. I read this and I read this, and I see this doesn't fit together. There are things inside of those books which are not mentioned within the public sphere. And you again know, okay, this is similar to your situation with your parents, with your mother, with your father, and there's a split in reality. There's an immediate detachment. And the difficulty is to get the attachment. I wouldn't speak of the West in the sense of, oh, this is the place that I'm attached to, similar like the region where the wine is made, and I have no real connection. I have often found myself in the position that I moved from one space to another place, to another. I was always jumping, and I was always carrying myself to every place where I was going, and that was a constancy. That is I. And to know myself, to know who I am, is the utmost important thing, to care for myself. Why should you, speaking with the Oracle of Delphi, perceive who you are? Of course, the second half is to take care of yourself. And I think this is the greatest important message which we got from Rousseau. Rousseau really was of that opinion, and he had the same sufferings. He had a father who was leaving him very early on, and who was of the same kind as I am. And he was later in a position where he had a romance with, where he called a woman that he loved mother. And this was, of course, scandalous for the time, but he used to praise himself with the saying, when I have published my confessions, the people will say of themselves, I know two people in the world. I know myself and I know Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then there is this interesting meeting between David Hume and Rousseau, and David Hume said, that guy doesn't know himself at all. He has no understanding of himself. And that is really fascinating, because they both are right. They are both great philosophers and thinkers, and I love it, because the more I know about myself, the more I think I see myself in Rousseau. He is I, in a sense, because he has the same conflicts. And I see it because there's the following story. I hope it's not uninteresting. When you want to stop me, please do. But I think it's quite interesting to know that there was this strange story where they were in a journey on a ship, and Rousseau was standing outdoors, and a great many people already have left the outdoor scene because there was a storm, it was raging. And imagine himself being filled with the rain, the water comes tumbling down, it hits him, and the weight drenches his coat and makes it heavier and heavier and heavier, and everyone else is gone. And Rousseau says, I know myself, and I'm a weak, unhealthy character. I have a weak disposition. And this was Hume's example to say he doesn't know himself.
Right.
And why is it? He knows how to react. He knows I will react in this situation like this. I know I am like that. I know how I will be in different situations. Wherever I go, I will be the sole constant factor. But he doesn't know how he scales in the hierarchy compared to others. Right. And that is the truth in David Hume. Right. And I think the meaning crisis for a lot of people who are of this kind, laid back, observing the situation, having the fortitude, not the courage, having the fear not to engage and really go into the world, this is it. I think really people have those restraints, and they are having the difficulty to embed themselves and to integrate themselves in a community, with a place. They have an abstract detachment, and they do not speak of the West, they speak of abstract principles. They do not speak of a certain region, they speak not of left and right brain, which is amazing, because the people seem to think we must make it as concrete as possible and locate the area where those principles come from. They come from the left brain, not from the right brain. They come from the West. They don't come from China. They come from this particular place, and the place is attached to it. Right. But I don't have this attachment. And there's a lot of the people who have similar inhibitions of that kind. And I think that is very important, that we also speak about those people, those difficulties, because this is much what I think is important within the meaning crisis.
Well, I think you're right in that there is this propensity to hover. There is this propensity to, we're gonna sit back. I mean, even what I do in my videos, I'm watching somebody else's videos, I'm making my comment. I'm watching someone else's videos, I make my comment. On YouTube, we're doing this in a very disembodied state. And there is in some ways a divorce between the different aspects of my life. The people in my church, for the most part, don't watch my videos. They wouldn't care to watch my videos. A lot of what I talk about in the videos, they're not particularly involved in, and don't really have a desire to become involved in. Similar way with with my family for the most part. My family doesn't watch my videos.
Mm,
But yet we're participating in this other that we're participating in this other area. And one of the desires for the estuary project for me again is the goal of that is to set up a space in which people can come. And when I talk about church life, I mean, I often tell people church, it's not hard to get into a church. You just have to keep going. You have to keep being there. And even then it's never quite that simple, because you can go to a church for a long time and still sort of feel on the outside. There's always those
mm,
inner ring things, but your observations about detachment, especially with someone like Rousseau, who, famously strange guy, terrible house guest. I mean, there's a lot of stories around Rousseau which are just lead you to believe. Yeah, it might have been interesting to have been able to say you knew Rousseau, but how much did you really want to be around Rousseau? And he was a bit of a curiosity, and you certainly wouldn't have wanted him for your father, because of obviously what he did with respect to his children has become famous as well.
I think
So
Rousseau would have agreed. He gave those children away because he wouldn't want them to have this kind of
for
person
their
as their father.
father. In other words, it would have been worse for them if they had him for their father.
In
Oh,
fact, I think he would have agreed. I think this would have been his own proposition.
huh. Wow.
Yeah.
So your main point, I think, is a good one. And in that, I mean, at least part of when we look at what's sort of developed over, and again, watching the McGill-Christ, Smachtenberger Vervaeke video, which is a
Mhm.
great example of the kind of content we're consuming, and again, the language is very telling. Um, and
Yes.
but to me, again, the thinking about the life is always a second order to the life itself. And we struggle with that, obviously, because we're creatures that, I've also been paying attention to Peugeot and his end of the world thing. And there right now in the culture is a lot of anxiety about worlds ending. And you
Mhm.
recognize that these worlds for us are narrative. They're sort of second order. We sort of look at them from outside. And
Mhm.
even when worlds end, we might not necessarily end. And we watch ourselves. And again, as a child of divorce, when your parents divorced, a world ended. And that world had some good things and some bad things. The world clearly had some misery, otherwise it wouldn't have ended.
Mhm.
And then when you went into your father's house, you were going into a different world, and you went to your mother's house, you're going into another world. So again,
Yes,
as a
with areas and rules and places with, yeah, of
That's
course.
right. And you were
Yeah.
embedded in them without any, I mean, as a child, there was no opting in or opting out. You were just simply subject to both of those worlds. Now, obviously, when you gain a certain age and you have a degree of independence, now in a sense you can form your own world for better or for worse. But and so you need that
Mhm.
that transjective relationship with those worlds, between I and the worlds, and then
Mhm.
your agency to deal to crafting those worlds and impacting those worlds. But yeah, you can't just sit back and not participate in any world is really not to be an agent, and even in some ways not to exist.
In some ways, and that is the difficult situation to which I want to come back, because what was really happening with the transition from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche is this kind of discussion and this kind of argument, because when we look at the household of Schopenhauer, his father, most likely, we don't know it, committed suicide, and
Mm,
his mother was a dragon, so to speak. And she wrote to him, it was terrible. There's a meme of this ongoing throughout the internet. Um, Time with you spent is terrible, and that it is so bad for my good temperament, and you are much too smart to endure, and you are much too clever for yourself, and the way that you are just annoying. And it would be
with a mother like that, no wonder his father killed himself.
Yes. And now you understand why I proposed that his system is the systematized height of, I think, idealism and of the laid back virtues of the way of looking at the world and always controlling. Does this fit? Does this not fit? And what we have with Viveki and his 4Ps is this difference between the different kinds of knowing. And when we have a perspectival knowledge, which is in contradiction to participatory knowledge, in contradiction to propositional knowledge, you always have to go against what you otherwise know. And it is similar when I translate, for example, what I know in the German language, and I say to you something, oh, bad thing, oh, shit, I cannot translate this small aspect of the German language, but he doesn't understand me when I do not translate it anyway. I don't have the words, and I need those resources, and then I give to you my translation, and then you answer to me, very honest, very friendly, and you do it completely wrong because you ignore what I know in the English, in the German language, and so you're doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing at the same time.
Yes.
And so, yes, I think that is really what the position is for a great many people who are unable to, for example, go into the Orthodox Church. And this is why I have a great dislike for Peugeot, because he oftentimes assumes things to be given of which I know otherwise. I have to ignore them. I have to ignore what I otherwise know and what I'm educated in. And then I say, of course, pragmatically this works, but theoretically speaking, I also know. And then this is a Tower of Babel which ruins everything. And I think this is the kind of problem that Schopenhauer pointed out. And then Nietzsche comes and he reads one of his dialogues. And this dialogue is called The Dialogue on Religion. Now you have to know, Schopenhauer never wrote a dialogue, except for one or two, except for this one. And when someone who usually uses arguments, philosophical pictures and something like this, always gives reasons, but not a dialogue. Why is it that someone who owes a lot to Plato writes a dialogue? Because of something that seems to be irresolvable, a situation that doesn't seem to be easy to solve. And his situation is he has two persons speaking to each other. The person of the truth, the other who is of the people, the person who represents the people. And he says the large amount of people will lose the faith, and only a few are looking for the truth, and the truth is so valuable, even if everything else perishes. He quotes that in Latin, we must uphold the truth. And then the other says, oh my goodness, you can't do that. And then he says, okay, you're right. Everything should be more or less proportionate. We should be careful with that. And Nietzsche noticed this, and he says, okay, that's interesting. There's a point where the search for truth leads in philosophy to pessimism, and the idea of a negation of the will to live, coming back to what you said before, in a sense, when you're always laid back and always looking at the world, you're not participating, you're not acting in it. And you have the situation in Marx. Karl Marx is a famous 11 physicist with regards to Feuerbach. He says, Feuerbach only looks at the world, but he doesn't. Is that me with the balloons, or is that you?
It's not me. The balloons started coming up when you meant Feuerbach. I thought, wow, look at Feuerbach, we're getting balloons.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay, doesn't matter. I will try to not repeat the name again. But he says he's not practically involved. He's only looking at the world, and there is his turn to the proletariat and to the masses. Yep. And we have this simultaneous situation in multiple authors, right? It's a situation of the time. And then he says, we need something else. And my philosophical system, the world as will and representation, will be what the few, the aristocrats in the world really need. And although religion will serve as a metaphysics for the masses, he argues in the same manner as Spinoza does.
Right.
This will be the case. And then Nietzsche later comes and says, forgive me, but this is something very preemptive. This is not a good solution. And he makes a pragmatic solution, and he introduces the master-slave morality. If all the people suffer, first solution, we ignore them. We ignore them and we go to the, only a master can carry on and go through the world because he wants to live. And he says, despite everything, in German, trotzdem, despite this, there is spite involved. I will do this even if you are right, Schopenhauer, I want to live. And this is interesting because he always speaks of the Dionysian principle, and the god of wine who makes you drunk is exactly that. He wants to bring you into a situation where you are embedded. And Nietzsche is always famous for the situation that he motivates all the people in the listens face, and they all are powered up and pushed up. And most of them are not the Herrenmenschen in his sense, you could argue, but they all are pushed up and they are all very motivated. And this is really what Nietzsche reintroduced. That is the idea that philosophy makes a theoretical description of the world, but pragmatically you have to do different. And this comes back to an Enlightenment thinker. And that's why I don't like the term counter-enlightenment. It is David Hume who says, reason is and ought to be nothing but a slave to the passions. And he means it in the sense that Nietzsche introduced later on, and says, we need this push, we need the errors, we need the Dionysian principles, which make us go. And Peterson grasps this, puts this on his altar and says, we too need a moral principle. We need the narratives, and they give us that. And the same situation is, here still the critique of Schopenhauer applies, because some people know something else about theories, about proposition, about systems, about philosophy, what the Enlightenment has taught them, and they have to ignore it. And now we are in this strange situation. You see this in the corner. Not everyone has read Immanuel Kant. Many people have not read Schopenhauer, not Hume, not Nietzsche, but they return to the orthodoxy, and the contradiction doesn't exist. They carry on. They live on. It doesn't matter what the philosophy says. Pragmatically, we can ignore it. We do not have to work at the height of the philosophers because life finds its way in other ways. And I think it's important that we have this distinction, and we do not have to follow what the philosophers say. And I think that is what Nietzsche did not grasp at his time. And I think this is relevant for our pragmatic solution. Ignore what the philosophers say. Just return if you can. And if you can't, you have to find another solution. And that is really the place where it comes in, what I would call the virtue of fortitude. You have to endure some of the contradictions, and sometimes you can't, and you suffer tremendously from it. And the question is, how long can I suffer? How long can I do it? Well, maybe you can do it until the end of your life. It will be a pathetic life, maybe, but you may be able to endure it. And I think the great problem for the Christians is to see other people suffer. And the question is really whether vitality, the breath of God, so to speak, which makes you affirm things, which makes you participate and engage in the community. You may be surrounded with what Augustine called monsters, who are not participating, who are split. And I think we need this other attempt. We need to understand that not everyone is a Christian nowadays, and they are of a different kind. We might need those resources again for those Christians who cannot see those who are seemingly Christian, but in practice and theoretically speaking, they are not really Christians. They might need this split worldview as another option, as another resource, I would argue.
I turned off the AI thing because more bubbles were coming up. I don't know if that was, I turned that on at the beginning, trying to get a transcript of this, and I don't know. When did you first get? I mean, obviously, you've read a lot of philosophy. You've thought about a lot of philosophy. When did you first get interested in philosophy, and why?
That's an interesting thing, because I have a very clear memory of it. It was like this. Every second weekend, I came to my father, obviously. And I visited him, and while eating breakfast, he was speaking of his experiences as a grown adult man. And he was always introducing me with the results. So I got the informations without having to go through the experiences which gave him those results. And so I was always speaking with the mouth and the teachings of a grown man. And so a young child, maybe 7, 10, 12, 14 years old, speaks to the teacher, speaks to the other children of his age, and talks with the knowledge of a grown-up man. And this is irritating. And this is irritating. And at the same time, I have this feeling there's a well inside of me, and I always carry out the water, and I get it out, and I get it out. How much water is left? It isn't good. It will be still left. How much is still left? If this carries on a little bit further, this discussion, I will have no water left. Okay, what to do? I was really fearful. I was really in anxiety due to this. And the first thing I came to is, what do I usually do? Yes, I read. Can I read? Oh, not the stories that I have. It doesn't help me. Okay, my father was talking about what? Those politics, they are of a liberal tradition. Okay, classical liberal tradition. Good. You have to read the classical liberal philosophers, and you have to read all of them to supplement you with all the arguments that you need, because what you need seems to be empty after a while, and you have to get more. You have to refill the well, so to speak.
So did your father have these books at home, and did you start reading them when you were young, or did you go to university and pick this up?
With 14, 15, 16 years of age, I would say.
Okay.
16 years of age, most likely. The earliest I imagine was when I was at my mother's house, and I had, well, as every young adolescent, we all have big feelings for a woman that we have not acquired. And so I was very bad, in a very bad mood and very depressed, and was reading Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a wonderful book because it introduces you immediately about the problems, what can happen when you are unethical. And I thought something similar to Nietzsche. I need to get rid of those restraints. Those restraints do not help me. And so I was inspired, similarly like the other young people by Nietzsche today, by Oscar Wilde. Then I read this, and this was my very first classic author, I would say.
Really?
And by him, I was introduced into philosophy, literature, and the classics. And by him, I got to Schopenhauer, and I really disliked his pessimism at first. And I became a pessimist due to my nature and to my experiences, but I disliked his pessimism at first, and I liked his aesthetics because of Oscar Wilde, which is quite funny. You wouldn't expect that.
So did you go to university and study philosophy then?
I studied philosophy, but not because of the things that philosophy at the university taught me. I was in political sciences and in sociology. And I was in 2 universities, in Rostock and in Greifswald. And so I had different options and occasions, and I successfully stopped studying sometime without a degree, regrettably. This is one of my biggest regrets in my life. I have all the knowledge without the document to prove it. I just have to open my mouth and I can prove it, but I don't have this piece of paper that I would need. And yes, this is another thing of mine.
Because you, I mean, in some of the live streams that we've spoken of, and now here too, I mean, one of the things that's noteworthy about your approach is you are well steeped with with this philosophical tradition. And for you, this is very much a living conversation. And when we talked about embedded or not embedded, you seem very embedded in the philosophical conversation. And that's a conversation that, I mean, now many of these philosophers are German. And so I think I'm sure it's definitely an advantage to at least read the original text instead of a lot of English speakers having to read them in a translation, which gets to that translation problem that you talked about before, because I would imagine reading any of these philosophers in English is not as salient, is not as gripping as reading them in the original language. I mean, that's almost always the case with a translation in the original language, because the translator has to try, in many ways, the translator has to try to bring in the other 3 Ps into the translation. Whereas, at least to a degree, even though there's a fair amount of time, there's not that much time that's passed between a lot of those philosophers and today. But It's and so it's, it's very striking how that philosophical conversation grips you, and how saliently, and how you can see, how you can apply what you see happening in this corner through that filter. And that's,
Mm,
most, I think most coming at this corner from the other direction, they might have, you'll learn a little bit about some of these characters, usually secondhand, not even reading the primary sources, but you very much
mm,
have a sense of reading the sources, dialoguing with the sources, and then applying those. And again,
exactly.
it is a rather interesting thing that you have. I mean, you clearly have mastery over a lot of this stuff, and you don't
Mm,
have a degree. Yeah, I see often others who have degrees in this stuff who don't. And mastery is not only an ability to, let's say, to prove to a teacher on a test, or to drop names and quote, but I think a mastery, again, in that other 3P section, is because when I listen to you, you sound very much like you are in dialogue
mm, mm,
with Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and many of these classics. These
mm,
philosophers have become friends and conversation partners for you, that they
most definitely.
haven't for many of the rest of us.
Yes, I very much joke that when I go back to the graveyard, where are most of my friends? No, it's a different way of life and a different way of living when you have what is seemingly the Alp on the mountain, and it is still carrying on and still at the top of my head, while most of the others don't feel it. And when I speak of those things and of most of those assumptions, I think there is a way to bridge what Peterson, Viveki, and others are doing, and there is enlightenment stuff in this, very much enlightenment stuff. And I think it's really, for me, it's irritating, and I get a little bit aggressive sometimes because people talk about the Enlightenment as if much of the things that I am really deeply involved doesn't exist. And
Right.
it's, in a sense, of course, an attack, existential attack on my existence, so to speak,
Mm.
when something is ignored. And so this is, of course, one of the reasons why I immediately grabbed the link to this conversation when someone posted it in the German language chat. I didn't really know that I was going for this conversation before yesterday. It was really, it's just a
Well,
coincidence.
nobody gets a lot of notice because I don't open them up until I look ahead at the schedule and say, "Oh, okay, I'll have some time this week." And so no,
Yeah,
nobody has a lot of notice, generally speaking, on these things. But the Enlightenment conversation is difficult because, of course,
yeah.
the Enlightenment isn't something like the Empire State Building. But even the Empire State Building is a very complex thing. Enlightenment isn't like this computer mouse. The
Mm,
Enlightenment, to use, one of the some of the language that Vervaeke has brought in, it's a hyper object.
mm,
It's a spirit. And so, all of these philosophers that you have mentioned very much are grappling with, in some ways, one aspect of the Enlightenment is the philosophy is a very interesting thing because it is sort of the creation of modern philosophy.
mm.
That and the Enlightenment are very, very close.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, and even thinking about, I mean, in some ways, philosophy is an alternative track, let's say, to the religious institutions that themselves had been stewarding and housing conversations. And so the Enlightenment and the Academy, even though it obviously grows out of Christendom and the church, is
Mm.
became its own track. And you had
Yeah.
conversations that in many ways were no longer under the discipline of a religious community. And of course, Spinoza, of course, breaks with his people. And part of what's many of the philosophers have in common is that, in fact, they break from the dominant religious tradition that has an institution, it has community. And I think that's a big aspect of the Enlightenment. And so your pushback, I mean, counter enlightenment is what Peterson is the term Peterson used. And so then
Exactly.
once he uses a term, it's like, okay, well, now at least we've got a reference, because we don't quite know, because part of my frustration with also sort of the, I don't want to dismiss many of my friends who are going back to historical conservative religions as nostalgia, because I don't think that's really what's going on. But I also I'm sort of a tweener in that we are not going to unlearn what we've been learning in the last 500 years, and I don't think we should.
I think you're right in that. And you mentioned Spinoza. I have him on my right side as well. And right in the introductory, I really loved this particular translator. He was one of the first ones, and he has a great translation into German. And he mentioned there that the Jewish people of Spinoza's time were the first people in Europe with a split consciousness. And so we return. I hate this.
I have no idea why this is happening.
I have no idea as well. But they were the first people with a split consciousness, and they are of the same type that I was describing with reference to my mother and father and my own consciousness, to Schopenhauer. And so he has the inhibitions, and he says, okay, we had to be in Spain we had to adopt the Christian belief, but we were not really willing. We didn't really want to go there. We are Jews somewhat, but we had to drop all the Jewish customs. And then they returned, they went elsewhere, they moved spaces, another parallelism, and they were not attached to the place. They went to another place, and there they had the option to either go into the one direction and to recapture, go back into the belly of a whale, with Peterson speaking. And then he discovered Spinoza. You read it through, and he says, I think there are things in the text which do not match the pragmatic traditions that we have. And you always have this very difficult situation that you have the four P's, so to speak, of different ways of relating to the word and perceiving the word. And you know one aspect, and for one way to engage with a word, you have to disregard this, you have to shift away this. And I met for about a year ago an old grandmother, and she was talking about her troubles in her childhood, and always putting and tossing things back in another room, back in another room, back in another room. And then she got into some kind of mental clinic, and she thought, what am I supposed to do here? I have no problems, I have no trouble at all. And the first results of her stay there was, I know now I have much more problems than I realized. And they all came upon me because the room was full and everything came out. And I think something very similar like that happens. We discover that people in their younger days now allow those contradictions to enter their life. And many people in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, or whatever, now become sick. And we allow them to go in that direction and to allow this kind of reaction, which we otherwise have only sort of pushed aside and pushed into another room, what Freud called Verdrängung. And I think this is very related to this, and it is very much related to inhibitions and to restraint. And how much restraint should we allow? And is fortitude of importance? And should we really do this at the cost of our own vitality, of the breath that we have inside of us? I think this is the discussion which we are having. And I like this sentence by Augustine. Next to the other human beings, there are monsters in human society. And monsters has this double meaning. It has demonstrare in the Latin meaning, I show to you what is of bigger proportion. Peterson speaks of a big ear. I think he meant really the big mouth, because the intellectual has this overcompensation of only being able to speak with his mouth, but not to engage with the word. There's a pragmatism, speaking with Feuerbach again, okay, no balloons, and Marx. And so you only look at the word, but the important thing is to change it, Marx says.
Yes.
And this is connected to that.
Yes.
And I think this is really this pragmatic application and the return to it. I think we have had too much water out of one kind of well, and we have to go to another well. And this is another thing I quite dislike. You spoke about the difference of English speaking word, and in my case, the German speaking word, and how difficult difficult it is to translate it. But I think I really dislike the way of framing and speaking of cultural battle. I would rather have it be recognized as a form as diet first, because I can decide what to take in, how much vitamins of this or that kind. What are we in need of? And the next thing is, when we speak in the sense of the attachment to a place, left brain, right brain, West, East, Asia, whatever, we always look at it not from this detached way. We do not have the possibility to detach ourselves. We are always involved in a way which might lead us to directions which are not good. And sometimes it is good to really detach ourselves, and sometimes we need the attachment. We need both. And I would like to have it like in the marketplace, a large amount of offerings from which I can choose. And when I have 20 tabs open, I say this is not enough. I want to have hundreds of tabs. And maybe this Internet Explorer then has its own problems, and then the next moment it crashes, and then they say, okay, maybe 100 tabs is not.
This is too many.
It's too many. It's too many. But I want to have the open the options on the desk. I want to choose from the options that I need, and that's the reason why we have to make stark contrasts and to really accentuate what is different, what we need, and I do not like this framing of a counter enlightenment, because all the contrasts get lost. And there is another enlightenment tradition which allows ourselves to really go that way. And I think the people have really thought only about a summary by the second-hand dealers of thinkers. They didn't read the systematized accounts of the original thinkers. It's similar, like, have you ever read Asterix, the girl?
No.
The French comic. Okay, there's a situation where the Smith says to the fish dealer, your fish is not good, it stinks, and they all hit upon each other, and there's this huge cloud, and everyone hits each other, and everyone really is in violent exchange. And then another person might look at this and say, okay, at least they are talking about fish, so that is really what we have in common. And so similarly, I would say it is with enlightenment. We shouldn't stretch this comparison, no case, but when you have an observer and each one fights his own battle, and they systematize it with their own problems in mind, they have their disagreements. It was a really productive time. It is not helpful to then go and take up the position of a historian, of an idea historian, who summarizes the general tendencies, and later on people are surprised when it doesn't work, because the people have had other assumptions in mind, other tabs open, and they followed it along and followed another direction. And then we say it's not about counter-enlightenment, it's about what tradition should we prefer? And this way is the wrong way, it seems. And there are different ways.
Well, Peter, I am out of time, and the next rando is in the queue, but it was lovely talking to you again. And I will share this with you, and if you'd like, I will share it with the channel. Balloons and all. I have no idea why we cartoons. But anyway, but thank you for getting the slot.
I really have to thank you as well. I really appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
Take care, Peter.
You too. Bye-bye.